Good evening from Austin, Texas. Our first story tonight is about one man who died in a federal detention center here in Texas. But it is so much bigger than that because it involves how the federal government spends billions of your tax dollars that our investigation has found are very difficult to trace. At issue is this. In 1997, Washington decided to outsource some incarcerations to private prison companies. Since then, some of the companies have made fortunes from the federal treasury with what turns out to be very little transparency and less accountability than you would think. Tens of thousands of inmates and detainees have now served time behind private prison bars in what turns out to be secretive, out-of-the-way places. And not everyone that has gone in has come out to tell their story. There's an old saying in this part of West Texas: you can look farther and see less than any place else in the world. There are also two constants here. It's flat and it's dry. Pecos is a small town smack dab in the middle of it, known most famously as the place where this country's first rodeo was held. It's the county seat for Reeves County, more than 2,600 square miles, a county bigger than Rhode Island. All that territory has a population of only 11,000 people, and many turn out for community events like the Christmas parade. But early one December morning, only a handful of people from across the state showed up for a very different kind of march. Their numbers may be small, but they say they're trying to accomplish something very big: change the way the U.S. government treats tens of thousands of men and women sentenced by federal courts to do time behind bars. The destination of the march was the Reeves County Detention Center, just off the main highway out of town. RCDC, as the locals call it, is hard to see behind all the razor wire. It's been around for 20 years, but since 2003, the county has paid the private prison giant, the GEO Group, to run it. It's a low-security lockup contracted since 2006 to hold federal inmates, and it's where 32-year-old detainee Jesus Galindo spent the last year of his life.
We are here in memory of Jesus Manuel Galindo, who died 1 year ago on December 12, 2008, while in solitary confinement. Because this is what happens when people seek medical care in this facility. They are put into solitary confinement. They don't receive medicine. They don't receive medical attention.
Galindo was, like many of his fellow inmates, serving time for being in this country illegally. The cause of his death is not in dispute. He'd suffered an epileptic seizure. The question is, why a condition that is treatable proved fatal? The Bureau of Prisons isn't talking. Neither is the GEO Group, one of the world's largest private prison companies.
What do we want? Medical care! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Medical care! When do we want it? Now!
GEO! We are watching. People continue to die for lack of medical care. That is unacceptable and un-American.
And it will continue to be unknown. That's because privately operated detention centers like Reeves are not required to disclose how they operate, despite the fact that U.S. taxpayers are footing the bill. An example: the Reeves facility can house over 3,500 inmates. So how many guards are there? Are there enough? Too many? Only those who run the prison know, and if you ask, they likely won't tell you. In the business of private prisons, it may be considered a trade secret. What about medical care? Is there enough qualified staff to treat the number of patients? That, too, unknown.
For the last couple of years, I've been on a quest for information. I work at the...
In late January, a group of experts who've been studying private prisons was invited to Capitol Hill to brief congressional staffers.
And there's no information, public information about the deaths, the medical care.
The general mood was one of frustration.
The
bottom line is we cannot find out whether these companies are actually lawfully operating the facilities that they are contracting with the federal government to operate in states where
Congress has been concerned about private prisons for a while. In 2007, it asked the Government Accountability Office to figure out whether private prisons were cost-effective. The GAO came back and said they couldn't even answer the question because the private prison companies didn't have to supply that kind of data.
If the Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison system arm, does not gather data from private prisons that they contract with, then they can't provide it to the public.
This briefing is part of an attempt by members of Congress to change the law, which would force private prison companies to become more transparent.
Sometimes you'll see a report that was generated by a private corrections company about a particular death. Sometimes you won't.
David Shapiro is an attorney at the ACLU National Prison Project, and for years they've been trying to get information from behind the private prison walls by using the Freedom of Information Act. But there's just one problem.
They're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act like other federal prisons. And the Freedom of Information Act is a lifeline, an information lifeline that lets us know what's going on behind the prison walls. It's not easy to enter a prison. And so the Freedom of Information Act is really an absolutely critical source of information, and it's one that just doesn't apply to private prisons.
And the federal government has increasingly been contracting with the private prisons.
That's absolutely right. There's been an explosive growth in the level of contracts between the federal government and private prisons and the number of prisoners that are being held in these facilities.
The official count of federal inmates housed in private prisons has more than doubled since 2000. And the Bureau of Prisons says it has spent $2.2 billion on private prison contracts within the last 4 years alone. That's a lot of taxpayer money.
It is a lot of taxpayer money. And these private prisons are clearly making enormous profits.
Shapiro says that what gets lost in the business decisions, the business of making money, is the most basic care of the inmates.
There's a tension between a private prison's bottom line to make money and the important governmental task that they're executing, which is to hold people in detention. And that can lead to cutting corners on a broad array of issues.